The Vietcong rose as freedom fighters, feared for their ambushes and jungle warfare. But behind the image of resistance was a hidden nightmare. Mothers, daughters, and young girls were kidnapped, enslaved, and executed. Families shattered, communities silenced. It had started before American troops even landed in Vietnam in the 1960s. The country was already split in two. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and the communist government were building power with help from China and the Soviet Union. In the south, leaders were trying to hold control, but they struggled with corruption, weak armies, and little support from the people. Life for ordinary families was hard. Vietnam was mostly farmland, and rice was the main food and income. Every hand in the family mattered. Daughters were expected to work long hours in the fields, take care of younger brothers and sisters, and help their parents keep food on the table. In many villages, girls carried the heaviest load of responsibility because men were often busy with political duties, forced labor, or preparing for conflict. But daily struggles were not the only problem. As tension grew between the North and the South, women began to feel the pressure first. The Viet Cong believed females could be used as tools to spread their control. Some young women were forced to deliver supplies, pass hidden messages, or even spy on neighbors. If they refused, punishment could be brutal. A single act of resistance could mark a woman as against the revolution. By the late 1950s, stories spread quickly from one village to another. People whispered about girls taken from their homes at night, never to be seen again. Families tried to hide their daughters, sometimes sending them to live with relatives far away, but safety was never certain. The Viet Cong wanted to show power, and targeting women was an easy way to scare entire communities. In 1959, the Viet Cong officially began their armed fight against the South. This was not a small conflict. It quickly grew into a campaign of terror that touched almost every village. The Viet Cong wanted control, and they were ready to use fear to get it. Anyone who refused to support them was seen as an enemy. Villagers could be accused of being traitors for something as simple as speaking to a government soldier, selling food to the wrong person, or even refusing to hand over their own harvest. Women became some of the first targets because they were less able to fight back. Many were dragged from their homes and forced to carry heavy loads of weapons, rice, and medical supplies through thick jungle trails. They often marched barefoot, carrying more than their own body weight on their shoulders. Refusing to do it was almost the same as asking to die. Some were executed in front of their families as a warning to others. Those who were not killed on the spot were often sent into re-education. These were not schools. They were cruel prisons where women were locked away, beaten, and starved until they agreed to serve the Viet Cong. Some were forced to watch other villagers suffer to break their spirits. The goal was to turn fear into obedience. And behind the hidden walls of remote jungle camps, things were even worse. Captured females were treated as property, not as human beings. Some were abused again and again by different groups of fighters. The abuse was so common that it became part of the system. But these crimes stayed hidden because speaking out was almost impossible. A single word of complaint could mean not just the death of the woman, but also the death of her parents, her brothers, and even her children. By the early 1960s, fear had spread like wildfire across the countryside. Women no longer felt safe even in their own homes. At night, families huddled in silence, praying the footsteps they heard outside were not Viet Cong fighters coming to take their daughters away. The Viet Cong did not only want to control the battlefield, they wanted control of their minds, and they knew that targeting women was one of the fastest ways to break a whole community. If a respected man in the village spoke out against them, The Viet Cong didn't always punish him directly. Instead, they would take his daughter, his wife, or even his sister. That simple act spread more fear than shooting him ever could. Entire villages learned quickly that silence was safer than resistance. Accusations became a weapon. Women were often called spies for the South or for the Americans, even when there was no proof. A simple visit to a government office, or even being seen near a soldier, was enough to bring suspicion. Once accused, there was almost no way to defend oneself. Many women were dragged into the center of their villages, tied up, and beaten, while neighbors were forced to watch. Some were executed publicly. Their bodies were sometimes left out in open spaces, so families and children could see them. The cruelty did not stop with farmers' daughters or poor villagers. Women with education were also in danger. Female teachers, nurses, and social workers were seen as threats because they held influence. A woman teaching children to read or giving medicine to the sick was dangerous in the eyes of the Viet Cong because education and health gave people strength. Many of these women disappeared suddenly. Families searched for them but found nothing. In many cases, they were taken deep into the jungle and never came back. By the mid-1960s, the war had entered a brutal stage. American soldiers were arriving in larger numbers, and the Viet Cong tightened their grip on villages and people. Women were pushed into roles they never chose and could not refuse. Some women were forced to cook and clean for entire Viet Cong units, preparing meals with food taken from their own families. Others were made to sew uniforms, dig trenches, or build traps. Many were ordered to carry weapons, explosives, and heavy sacks of rice through dangerous jungle trails. The loads were so heavy that women often collapsed from exhaustion, but stopping to rest could bring beatings or even death. Beyond these visible tasks, darker roles were forced upon them. They lived under constant guard and were treated as possessions rather than human beings. Sexual abuse became a tool of control. Some were forced into what the Viet Cong called marriages with fighters. But these were not real marriages. They were a cover for abuse, designed to make the violence seem acceptable. Refusal was not tolerated. Women who resisted were beaten until they could no longer stand, or executed as examples to the others. Pregnancies soon followed. Many women gave birth in the jungle far from any hospital or midwife. They delivered their babies alone in the dirt, without clean water or medicine. Some newborns died within hours, while others lived only a few weeks. Mothers often faced infections and lifelong injuries, but they received no care. Their pain was invisible, hidden by the war. This suffering passed from one generation to the next. Children born under these conditions carried the burden too. Some grew up without fathers, marked by the circumstances of their birth. Others never survived to see childhood. For the women, it was not only their own lives that were destroyed, but also the futures of the children they bore. And yet the Viet Cong didn't care. To them, females were expendable. By now, fear lived in every home. Villages were small, tightly connected communities where everyone knew each other. But during the war, these once peaceful places became traps. Mothers warned their daughters never to walk alone, even in daylight. Fathers built hiding spaces under floors or behind walls to protect their girls when Viet Cong fighters came. Families whispered plans about where to run if footsteps were heard at night. Yet no amount of planning could guarantee safety. Hiding rarely worked because the Viet Cong searched houses carefully, tearing through walls, lifting mats, and dragging women out into the open. The danger was not limited to one part of Vietnam. In provinces like Quang Nai, Quang Tri, and the wide stretches of the Mekong Delta, whole groups of women were rounded up in single raids. Some were taken away in silence and were never seen again. Families were left with empty doorways and unanswered questions. Others returned days or weeks later, but they were no longer the same. Many carried visible scars from beatings. Others carried wounds that no one could see, locked deep in their minds, leaving them unable to speak about what had happened. While villages lived under fear, the deepest horrors were hidden in the jungle. Scattered through thick forests were secret Vietcong camps. These camps held all kinds of prisoners, captured soldiers, suspected civilians, and many women who had been taken from their homes. Life inside was worse than death for many. The camps were made of bamboo huts, barbed wire, and underground tunnels. Prisoners slept on mud floors surrounded by insects, rats, and the constant sound of guards shouting. Food was scarce. Most prisoners were given a handful of rice or thin soup once a day, barely enough to keep them alive. Medicine was almost never provided. Even small wounds turned into infections, and the fever spread quickly. Women, already weak from hunger, had no strength to fight diseases like malaria, dysentery, or skin infections. Many died slowly, and their bodies were buried in shallow pits near the camps, without a name or marker. Some women were stripped and locked in bamboo cages so small they could not stand up straight. They were left in the open, exposed to heat, rain, and insects for days. The humiliation broke their spirits before their bodies gave out. Pregnancy in the camps brought more tragedy. Women who became pregnant, often because of abuse, were still forced to carry loads, dig tunnels, or cook for fighters. They were made to work until their bodies collapsed. When babies were born, there was no care, no clean water, and no protection. Some newborns were taken away immediately and left to die, treated as if they were unwanted burdens. Mothers cried in silence, knowing they were powerless to save their children. Survivors who later escaped told stories of endless hopelessness. Guards made it clear that escape attempts would bring punishment, not only to the woman herself, but also to her family back in the village. This meant many stayed, enduring the nightmare to protect their loved ones from even worse fates. For those who survived, the memories of those camps never left them. Even decades later, the scars remained. As the war grew more intense, American troops began pushing further into Vietcong strongholds. What they found shocked even hardened soldiers. Deep inside the jungles, they stumbled upon abandoned camps. At first, these places looked like clusters of bamboo huts and trenches. But a closer look revealed the truth. Blood stains marked the ground and walls. Ropes and chains were still tied to wooden posts. Narrow bamboo cages, barely big enough for a person to crawl into, stood empty. Every so often, a survivor was discovered. Some were women who had managed to escape or had been left behind when the Vietcong fled. American medics, used to treating battle wounds, were horrified by what they saw. Many women arrived with untreated infections, bones that had healed in twisted shapes, or deep scars from burns and beatings. Their bodies showed signs of starvation, including sunken eyes, frail frames, and skin stretched tightly over bones. But it was not only their bodies that carried pain. Many victims were too frightened to speak. Years of living under threats had silenced them. Some would not even look soldiers in the eye, fearing punishment if they said the wrong thing. A few whispered broken words, hinting at the abuse they endured, but most remained silent. To the medics, the silence was almost worse than the wounds. It revealed how deeply fear had taken hold in these women. The American soldiers had come to fight an enemy in battle, but here they saw the suffering of women who had never held a weapon. Some soldiers wrote about these discoveries in letters home, trying to explain the cruelty they had witnessed. Others carried the memories quietly. Even after that, the war kept going. In early 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year, known as Tet, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched a massive surprise attack. Tet was usually a time of family gatherings, food, and prayers for peace. People expected a short pause in fighting, because even in war, traditions still mattered. But instead of calm, the country was hit with one of the largest and bloodiest attacks of the entire war. The assault was launched on January 30th, 1968. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army struck more than 100 cities, towns, and villages across South Vietnam. Places that had felt far from the war were suddenly turned into battle zones. Streets filled with gunfire, grenades, and explosions. Homes burned, temples collapsed, and markets became fields of death. Civilians had nowhere safe to hide. For women, the Tet Offensive was a nightmare. In areas where the Viet Cong gained control, even temporarily, females were among the first to suffer. Many were accused of secretly helping Americans or of being loyal to the South Vietnamese government. These charges were often random, made without any real evidence. Soldiers dragged women from their homes. Some were beaten in front of neighbors, while others were executed immediately in the streets. The city of Hue became the most infamous example. Hue, once known for its ancient temples and quiet beauty, turned into a city of terror. For nearly a month, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese held it under their control. During that time, mass killings took place on a scale never seen before in the war. Entire families were wiped out. Women and girls were not spared. Some were shot, others stabbed, and some were buried alive in shallow graves. Survivors later described the earth shaking as mass burials took place, with muffled cries still coming from beneath the dirt. But not all victims died right away. Many women who survived the first attacks were rounded up and taken to makeshift prisons, schools, or hidden jungle camps. In these places, conditions were cruel beyond words. Women were beaten daily, denied food, and left sick without medicine. Rape became another weapon used to break their spirit. It was not only about control of the body, it was about destroying their will, their dignity, and their hope. The scale of suffering during Tet was far greater than before. Because the Viet Cong controlled entire towns and cities for days or even weeks, the abuse was more organized and spread to larger numbers of women. Villages that once had only whispered stories of kidnappings now had open, undeniable proof of mass violence. Families were torn apart, and many women never returned home. As the war dragged on, more women disappeared. Some were never reported because families feared revenge. Silence became the shield, even though it protected no one. Females carried a double burden. They lost fathers, brothers, and husbands to the war. At the same time, they lived under constant threat from the Viet Cong. Survival meant enduring humiliation, violence, and loss. Even after years of suffering, their voices were muted. The world focused on soldiers, weapons, and politics. The stories of women were drowned out. When America started pulling its soldiers out in 1973, many people in South Vietnam thought the violence might finally calm down. Families prayed that the nightmare would end. But for women, things only became worse. With fewer U.S. troops around, the Viet Cong grew stronger and bolder. Villages that once had some protection were now left vulnerable. In the countryside, women became easy targets. In provinces around Saigon and in the Mekong Delta, Viet Cong fighters dragged women from their homes, accusing them of helping Americans or spying for the South Vietnamese government. Some were shot immediately in front of their families as a warning. Others were taken away and never returned, leaving families to live in years of silence and grief. Life in these final years was filled with constant fear. Girls were hidden in basements, attics, and even underground pits. But hiding rarely saved them. Rumors spread quickly about women being taken to secret sites where they were abused and forced into labor. Entire communities were too terrified to resist. By 1975, when Saigon finally fell, the suffering reached its breaking point. Streets were filled with chaos, and people tried to escape. Many women and children rushed towards boats, hoping to flee the country across dangerous seas. Some managed to leave, but many were caught before they could. Those captured faced brutal punishment. Some were executed on the spot, while others were locked away in re-education camps, where hunger, disease, and abuse became part of daily life. For countless females, the war didn't end with peace. It ended with chains. After the fall of South Vietnam, the new communist government tried to erase many stories. But pain cannot be erased. Women who survived carried trauma into the rest of their lives. Some lived with injuries that never healed. Others carried the shame of being abused in silence. Many children born from abuse grew up without knowing their fathers, often facing stigma in society. The full scale of what females suffered may never be known. Too many voices were silenced. Too many graves were never marked.